The truth doesn't politely knock and ask for permission to enter the room. Sometimes, the truth kicks the door completely off its hinges, walks straight into the dining room, and unapologetically shatters the quiet, comfortable illusions that everyone else had silently agreed to live by. Most people in this world do not inherently hate intelligence. They do not inherently hate grace, and they certainly do not inherently hate the divine light that you naturally carry. What they absolutely despise is the suffocating, inescapable feeling of inadequacy that your light forces them to confront within their own manufactured, highly curated existence. They hate what your quiet authenticity makes them feel about their own chosen ignorance and stagnation. Chosen ones, you know exactly what this heavy, confusing dynamic feels like. You have been walking through a prolonged season of profound spiritual awakening, immense personal growth, and a crushing sense of isolation. You have watched quietly, holding your tongue and preserving your peace, while deeply insecure, toxic, and highly performative individuals tried to meticulously mimic your essence, while simultaneously plotting to bring you down. You have been painted as the villain in stories where you were entirely the victim, and you have endured the psychological warfare of people who secretly competed with you simply because they lacked the internal architecture to build their own lives. But then, the atmosphere shifted. Everything flipped overnight. The intricate, fragile web of deceit they spent months or years spinning simply evaporated into thin air. And now, out of nowhere, someone is fiercely defending you. Someone who was once a bystander, or perhaps even someone who once stood on the opposing side, has suddenly woken up, stepped forward, and is swinging a metaphorical sword on your behalf. The haters are currently experiencing a spectacular, highly public meltdown because their false narrative has completely collapsed, and they have lost absolute control over the perception of who you are. You did not have to send a single text message. You did not have to make a single phone call, and you did not have to lower your vibration to clear your name. The universe did the heavy lifting for you. Let us break down exactly why these performative people are exposing themselves in their desperate scramble to outpace you, why they melted down over your success, and why this sudden, fierce vindication has fundamentally destroyed their psychological framework. Let us dive deep into the raw mechanics of this shift. Let us begin. Before we dissect the anatomy of this divine reversal, I need you to do something. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Number 1, the sudden catastrophic collapse of their carefully curated echo chamber and the profound panic of the exposed imitator. You must understand that highly toxic, performative people cannot survive in the open air of objective reality. They require a hermetically sealed echo chamber to breathe. They need yes men, enablers, and a compliant audience to validate their distorted version of events. Contrast your authentic, hard-earned, internal alignment with their borrowed, insecure, and externally validated facade. You are anchored in source energy, entirely comfortable in your silence, and rooted in an objective truth that stands firm, whether one person believes it or 1 million people believe it. They, however, are operating on a severe psychological deficit. They spent an enormous amount of spiritual capital convincing everyone around them that you were the problem. They whispered in the ears of mutual connections, planted seeds of doubt, and meticulously curated a narrative where they were the innocent casualty of your boundaries. The deep psychology here is rooted in their absolute terror of independent thought and their profound fear of stagnation. They panic at the idea of anyone analyzing the situation with critical thinking, because they know their story is full of gaping holes. The person who is now fiercely defending you simply stopped listening to the echo and started looking at the tangible evidence. The defender had a moment of cognitive dissonance that completely shattered the spell. It is exactly like someone furiously stacking paper cards on a windy table while you have been quietly stacking heavy bricks on solid ground. The hater was constantly hovering over their card tower, sweating, frantic, blocking the wind with their hands, begging everyone not to breathe too hard. All it took was one person to step back, notice the sheer absurdity of the frantic performance, and exhale. The house of cards collapsed in an instant. Elaborating on this dynamic, the hater is now melting down because they realize that once the echo chamber is breached, it can never be magically resealed. They cannot put the blindfold back on someone who has finally seen the light. Watching them try to reconstruct a shattered illusion from the bent, broken cards of their reputation is a profoundly tragic spectacle to witness. It looks entirely goofy from the outside, like a delusional dictator demanding absolute loyalty from a completely empty room. Number 2, you forced them to confront the spiritual intelligence and authentic alignment they deliberately abandoned for cheap, external validation. The individuals who have secretly competed with you harbor a deep, unacknowledged resentment toward you because your mere existence is a walking, breathing mirror. You reflect the massive dreams they gave up on, the difficult truths they refused to swallow, and the spiritual corners they happily cut for the sake of temporary comfort or social acceptance. They chose the easy, highly performative route. They learned the script of society, wore the cheap masks required to fit in, and completely abandoned their own inner compass to gain the fleeting applause of a crowd. Contrast this heavy compromise with your authentic life. You chose the incredibly narrow, difficult path. You did the grueling shadow work, processed your heavy trauma, and vehemently refused to compromise your soul for a seat at a highly toxic table. The deep psychology of the imitator in this scenario is driven by a fragile ego that is utterly terrified of its own internal void. They do not necessarily hate you as a person. They hate the immense, suffocating regret you awaken within their own stagnant spirit. They dedicated their entire lives to convincing themselves that the authentic path was impossible. But your daily survival proves them wrong every single time you wake up. When everything flips overnight and a third party steps up to fiercely defend you, it is the ultimate psychological nightmare for the imitator. It is exactly like someone wearing incredibly heavy, gaudy, ostentatious jewelry that they clearly cannot afford, strutting arrogantly into a room and demanding to be treated like royalty. To the untrained eye, it might look shiny from across the street, but the defender finally got close enough to see the green stains forming on the hater's neck. They saw the cheap gold plating visibly chipping away. The defender is defending you now because they are profoundly embarrassed that they ever thought the hater's cubic zirconia existence was real, especially when placed directly next to the unpolished, undeniable diamond of your lived experience. This triggers a frantic meltdown because the hater realizes their entire lifetime of compromising their soul bought them absolutely nothing of real, lasting value. They are left entirely unmoored, desperately trying to justify their fake jewelry, while the entire room is mesmerized by your natural, unadorned, heavy light. Number 3, the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a fabricated reality finally caused their performative empathy to violently fracture in public. One of the most dangerous and insidious traits of a highly insecure person is their ability to weaponize empathy. They expertly present themselves as the tragic victim or the deeply concerned friend, using a soft, highly calculated voice and manipulative tears to rally people against you. They gather a compliant audience, pitching themselves as the righteous protector against your supposed toxicity and erratic behavior. Contrast this manipulative show with your radical, unyielding self-responsibility. When you hurt, you process it internally. You go to the divine. You sit in the heavy silence, and you heal your own wounds. You absolutely do not bleed on people who did not cut you. The performative hater, however, uses their manufactured wounds as a primary social currency, but a completely fabricated reality requires an immense, continuous amount of psychological caloric energy to sustain. Truth is entirely effortless. Lies require a full-time, highly stressed management team. The deep psychology of the hater reveals a profound reliance on a script that you vehemently refuse to follow. Because you refuse to engage in their dramatic, highly publicized tug-of-war, you starved them of the reactionary fuel they so desperately needed to keep their narrative alive. In the absolute absence of your reaction, their performance began to buckle heavily under its own dead weight. They started contradicting themselves. Their timelines stopped lining up, and the vicious, vindictive monster, hiding beneath the mask of fake concern, violently broke through the surface. It is highly akin to watching a melodramatic actor on a stage, screaming their lines, crying, throwing heavy props, and demanding a reaction from a completely empty spotlight. The actor gets so furious that the other character isn't showing up, that they jump off the stage, run into the audience, and start violently shaking a person who is just quietly sitting there. The defender looked at the hater, sweating, unhinged, and completely frantic, and then looked at you, perfectly calm and deeply anchored. The entire illusion evaporated in a split second. The defender stepped in because they felt an overwhelming sense of disgust at how meticulously the attackers tried to play God with your reputation, only to trip completely over their own tangled web of deceit. Watching the imitator scramble to patch the holes in their sinking narrative is a tragic, goofy spectacle. Number 4. Your relentless, unbothered silence starved their chaotic ego to the point of a deeply humiliating, highly public meltdown. The ultimate, overarching goal of an insecure person attempting to tear down a chosen one is to actively make you break character. They desperately want to trigger you into a state of severe emotional reactivity so they can confidently point their finger and say to the world that they were right all along, and you are the absolute problem. They are heavily relying on you to hand them the exact ammunition they desperately need to validate their long-running smear campaign. Contrast your profound internal alignment and emotional sovereignty with their incredibly shallow, chaotic external performance. When you were unjustly provoked, you did not behave like a fragile ego, needing to scream your absolute innocence from the rooftops. You gracefully retreated into your impenetrable spiritual fortress. You allowed time and undeniable truth to be your only defense attorneys. The psychology of the imitator in this specific dynamic is driven by a deep, terrifying loss of absolute control. When an emotional vampire cannot draw fresh blood, they begin to severely starve, and starvation makes them incredibly feral. They aggressively overcompensated for your heavy silence by becoming much louder, more erratic, and intensely vindictive to the outside observer, to the specific person who is now fiercely defending you. This massive contrast became completely impossible to ignore. It is exactly like watching a frantic hammer violently striking a massive, silent anvil. The hammer keeps violently striking, making a massive, obnoxious amount of noise, throwing chaotic sparks everywhere, sweating, and entirely exhausting itself. The anvil does absolutely nothing. It just sits there, completely unbothered, perfectly solid, heavily grounded in the earth. Eventually, the hammer completely shatters itself against the unyielding, quiet strength of the anvil. The defender watched the hater swinging wildly at you, watched you absorb the kinetic energy without even flinching, and realized with absolute, terrifying certainty exactly who held the real power and who was entirely possessed by weakness. The hater's ego suffered a catastrophic, irreversible collapse because their entire strategy was predicated on you losing your mind. They are now experiencing a deeply humiliating public meltdown because they have completely exposed their own unhinged malice to the room. They are fiercely defending you now because they are in pure awe of your emotional regulation, and they are deeply, viscerally repulsed by the hater's utter lack of it. Number 5. The silent observer recognized the terrifying emptiness behind the highly orchestrated smear campaign and chose your undeniable gravity instead. Smear campaigns are inherently hollow and fundamentally spiritually bankrupt. They are meticulously built on exaggerated half-truths, deeply projected insecurities, and outright malicious fabrications. When insecure, performative people gather to tear you down, they create a highly toxic collective delusion where they mutually validate their shared misery and stagnation. Contrast your beautiful life, which is operating out of a place of massive divine overflow, with their miserable lives, which are operating out of a place of severe spiritual deficit. You have spent your precious time nurturing your deep mind, healing your heavy heart, and staying deeply connected to your divine source. Because of this, you naturally radiate a quiet, undeniable, heavy gravity. People feel intrinsically safer around you, even if they cannot intellectually explain exactly why. The performative imitator has absolutely no internal gravity. They are tethered entirely to fleeting, external validation. The deep psychology here involves the complete breakdown of the bystander's prolonged cognitive dissonance. For a long while, it is much easier for people to blindly go along with the group narrative simply to avoid rocking the fragile boat. But there always comes an absolute breaking point. The defender began to actively look for the tangible, physical evidence of your supposed wickedness. They looked at your life and saw you quietly minding your own business, healing and beautifully growing. Then, they looked at the lives of the people orchestrating the smear campaign and saw deep bitterness, high paranoia, and an obsessive, frantic fixation on your every move. It is perfectly like placing a single, highly concentrated drop of pure, brilliant dye into a massive vat of cloudy, deeply stagnant water. The hater arrogantly thought the stagnant water would quickly dilute the beautiful dye. Instead, that single drop slowly, inevitably, and permanently alters the entire molecular structure of the vat. The defender caught the absolute truth from your quiet resilience. They realized that the attackers were not a group of concerned individuals, but a sad cult of shared misery. They stepped in to fiercely defend you. because they realized the attack was never about holding you accountable. It was a desperate psychological coping mechanism used by miserable people trying to distract themselves from their own colossal failures. Watching the hater frantically try to keep the blind sheep in line while the gate is standing wide open is a profoundly goofy, deeply tragic sight. Number 6. They foolishly assumed your spiritual isolation was a permanent sign of weakness, completely ignorant to the fact that it was an incubation chamber for your massive power. One of the absolute primary tactics of a deeply insecure competitor is forced social starvation. They actively, aggressively try to highly isolate you. They desperately want to cut off your resources, turn your mutual friends against you, and leave you entirely alone in the pitch black. Contrast your absolute, peaceful comfort in your own company with their desperate, highly parasitic need for a clapping crowd. Toxic, performative people constantly project their own deepest, darkest phobias onto you. The hater has a massive, crippling phobia of being alone with their own thoughts, because their internal landscape is a terrifying wasteland of severe insecurity, deep shame, and unhealed trauma. They arrogantly assume that if they can successfully isolate you, you will completely wither away and desperately beg for readmission into their toxic circle. But they fundamentally, catastrophically misunderstood the exact nature of a chosen one. You absolutely do not fear the dark, precisely because you carry your own massive internal light. You utilize the deep isolation they maliciously designed for your destruction as a quiet, sacred sanctuary for your profound evolution. The absolute psychological devastation for the hater occurred when they finally looked into the dark isolation chamber they built for you and saw that you had beautifully redecorated it. You entirely thrived. You became much sharper, heavily focused, and deeply spiritually attuned. It is the perfect, undeniable metaphor of a foolish person locking a powerful seed in a pitch-black room, completely oblivious to the scientific fact that absolute darkness and heavy pressure are the exact requirements for a seed to take deep root and violently burst through the hard soil. The defender quietly watched this entire magnificent dynamic play out. The defender saw the hater obsessively, frantically checking to see if you were suffering. And the defender saw you blooming quietly, beautifully in the heavy shadows. The sheer, undeniable grace of your survival completely exposed the profound cruelty of their original intentions. It is incredibly goofy and frantically pathetic from the outside, looking in to watch someone try to intentionally, aggressively starve a person who has an infinite, internal supply of divine, living water. The defender is fiercely defending you because they recognize that anyone who could beautifully survive that level of targeted isolation is operating under massive divine protection. Number 7. The imitator is having a profound psychological meltdown because their stolen, heavily plagiarized script just got aggressively rejected by the audience. Let us deeply analyze the highly performative, parasitic nature of the insecure people secretly competing with you because they entirely lack a solid core sense of self. They assemble their fake personality by aggressively scavenging the unique traits, specific aesthetics, and brilliant ideas of the exact people they deeply envy. They obsessively studied your calm demeanor. They desperately tried to adopt your vocabulary. They clumsily attempted to mimic your passions, all while simultaneously trying to entirely destroy the original source you happen to be. Contrast. Your highly organic, seamless, decades-long spiritual evolution with their frantic, Frankenstein-like assembly of completely stolen personality traits. They arrogantly believed that if they could just recite the lines perfectly, if they could just wear the stolen costume convincingly enough, the world would blindly hand them the massive respect and deep admiration that is naturally, effortlessly drawn to your authentic spirit. The deep psychology of the imitator in this exact moment is a frantic, tragic, highly anxious mess. They suffer from a profound, crippling identity crisis, and your effortless authenticity drives them absolutely insane with burning jealousy. But mimicry without internal integration absolutely always results in a grotesque, highly uncomfortable caricature. Eventually, this severe energetic mismatch becomes viscerally repulsive to the subconscious mind of an intelligent observer. It is exactly like walking into a high-end art gallery and seeing a cheap, soulless, AI-generated replica placed directly next to a priceless, centuries-old Renaissance masterpiece. For a fleeting, highly distracted second, a passing glance might confuse the two. But the exact moment the defender stopped and actually looked, the moment they studied the heavy brushstrokes, the profound depth of the color, and the raw soul poured onto the canvas, the replica became an incredibly insulting, deeply goofy joke. When the narrative completely flips overnight and a defender steps up for you, it is the exact equivalent of the audience halting the entire play, pointing directly at the frantic hater, and loudly yelling that they are a total fraud. The defender is defending you because they are fiercely protecting the sanctity of the original masterpiece. They realize that allowing the hater to parade around in a hollow replica of your skin is a massive offense to authenticity itself. The hater is completely shattered because their entire survival strategy has been catastrophically derailed, leaving them standing entirely naked with no lines to read. Number 8. We are witnessing the massive energetic boomerang in real time, where absolutely all their toxic projections are violently returned to sender. The deeply miserable people who obsessively hate and frantically compete with chosen ones are absolute masters of psychological projection, because they are fundamentally, entirely unwilling to process their own massive shame, deep guilt, severe inadequacy, and rotting malice. They subconsciously package all that psychological garbage and aggressively attempt to hand it directly to you. Contrast your deep, uncompromising self-awareness and absolute willingness to heal with their complete, highly stubborn refusal to take any accountability for their own darkness. Every single time they loudly called you arrogant, it was their own deeply repressed, highly fragile ego speaking. Every single time they accused you of being manipulative, it was a glaring confession of their own highly hidden tactics. The deep psychology here heavily involves the hater experiencing an acute, entirely devastating narcissistic injury. When their heavy projections completely failed to land, they purposefully created a thick, suffocating cloud of highly toxic energy and desperately tried to force you to breathe it in, hoping it would poison your pure spirit. But your authentic, hard-earned internal alignment acted as an impenetrable, high-frequency, massive shield. Now the absolute overnight flip has occurred, and the heavy laws of spiritual physics are taking full, devastating effect. The sudden, fierce defense of your name by a third party acts as the massive energetic boomerang. The defender is not just shielding you. They are the exact physical mechanism by which the universe intercepts all that projected toxicity and violently slingshots it right back into the frantic hater's face. It is exactly like watching someone maliciously, aggressively spit into a massive hurricane. only for the highly violent wind to immediately blow it right back onto their own shocked face. They are utterly disgusted, incredibly frantic, and highly outraged, completely failing to realize that they are literally choking on their own toxic saliva. It is a deeply tragic and highly poetic form of massive justice. The hater scrambles frantically to play the ultimate victim, loudly crying about how unfairly they are being treated, completely blind to the fact that they are simply harvesting the exact rotting seeds they joyfully planted. You, meanwhile, remain entirely untouched, deeply rooted in your authentic truth, quietly watching as the imitator desperately drowns in the very same shallow puddle they tried to drag you into. Number 9. The fierce, unexpected defense exposes the sheer embarrassing absurdity of their completely one-sided, highly obsessive competition with you. One of the most bizarre, deeply unsettling aspects of dealing with highly insecure, toxic imitators is the ultimate realization that they have been engaged in an intense, life-or-death marathon completely with you, while you weren't even remotely aware a race was happening. You were simply walking your own path, heavily focused on your own healing, your own massive spiritual growth, and your own undeniable divine purpose. Contrast your intense, inward focus on deep self-mastery with their highly erratic, outward, obsessive fixation on your absolutely every move. They meticulously measured every single aspect of their sad life against yours. If you achieved something beautiful, they had to aggressively diminish it or frantically try to immediately outdo it. If you suffered a heavy setback, they loudly celebrated it as a massive personal victory. The deep psychology of their complete meltdown entirely stems from the profound, crushing humiliation of being caught publicly shadowboxing an imaginary opponent. They painstakingly built a massive, highly imaginary stadium in their own head, where the two of you were fierce gladiators fighting to the absolute death. But when the dynamic completely flips, and someone fiercely defends you, the massive floodlights in that imaginary stadium are suddenly turned all the way on, revealing that the frantic hater is completely alone in the dirt arena, swinging wildly and aggressively at the empty air. The defender steps in and essentially points out to absolutely everyone watching that this individual is sweating profusely to combat nobody. This completely exposes the deep, highly embarrassing absurdity of the hater's obsession. It looks incredibly goofy, much like someone who arrogantly showed up to a quiet, solitary meditation retreat wearing full, heavy tactical riot gear, entirely ready for a massive war that fundamentally does not exist. The defender's highly vocal intervention completely shatters the illusion of the grand rivalry, forcing the hater to painfully realize that their intense, fiery hatred was completely unreciprocated, rendering absolutely all their frantic, exhausting efforts pathetic and deeply meaningless. Their fragile ego completely fractures under the massive weight of this highly public humiliation, leading to an erratic, highly tragic attempt to justify their absurd behavior to an audience that has already lost absolutely all respect for them. Number 10. They never actually expected you to survive the targeted spiritual warfare long enough to see their true faces exposed in the blinding light of day. The highly malicious tactics used by insecure, deeply performative individuals are heavily reliant on a cowardly strategy of psychological attrition. They absolutely do not fight fair, and they certainly do not fight quickly. They strongly prefer to slowly, aggressively drain your precious energy through 1,000 tiny, highly invisible cuts. Contrast your immense, massive spiritual endurance, deeply anchored in unshakable faith, with their complete reliance on cheap, temporary, highly manipulative tactics. They utilized severe gaslighting, cruel silent treatments, subtle but highly aggressive exclusions, and pervasive, heavily orchestrated smear campaigns, all meticulously designed to steadily erode your sanity and your deep spiritual resolve. The deep psychology of their current absolute panic is rooted in the terrifying, crushing realization that their absolute best, most highly concentrated, most deeply malicious efforts were ultimately completely powerless against your massive internal architecture. They bet their entire fragile ego on your eventual, highly public destruction. They were playing a highly exhausting long game, waiting with eager, malicious anticipation for the exact day you would finally break, lash out, or completely surrender to the false narrative they so carefully created. But you, chosen one, possess a deep spiritual endurance that completely defies highly toxic human logic. You absolutely did not break. You gently bent. You cried heavily in private. You sought massive divine counsel, but you completely refused to shatter. Your mere quiet survival is a profound, entirely unforgivable insult to their highly strenuous efforts. It is the exact metaphor of standing arrogantly on a beautiful beach and watching the ocean tide pull back abnormally far. The hater saw the water rapidly receding and foolishly thought they had successfully conquered the massive ocean. They ran out onto the exposed sand, loudly cheering their massive victory, entirely ignorant of the highly destructive physics of a massive tsunami. You heavily stayed on the high ground. The defender, noticing the undeniable signs, ran rapidly to the high ground entirely with you. And then the massive, highly crushing wave of undeniable truth hit the shore with terrifying, absolute force. The hater is currently frantically drowning in the exact dark waters they aggressively tried to drown you in. Number 11. The person defending you is not merely defending a human being. They are acting as an activated agent, defending the massive concept of absolute truth itself. It is incredibly crucial to completely zoom out and deeply understand the massive spiritual magnitude of exactly what is happening when this overnight flip entirely occurs. The toxic, highly performative people attempting to desperately mimic or entirely destroy you do not just have a petty personal vendetta against you. They have a fundamental, highly adversarial relationship with the absolute truth. Contrast your unyielding, massive commitment to objective reality and radical, deep honesty with their highly self-created distortion field, where hard facts are entirely malleable and deep emotions are aggressively manipulated for personal gain. They are highly active agents of deep psychological chaos. You, conversely, are a massive, immovable anchor of absolute truth. You completely represent reality in its raw, unfiltered, highly uncomfortable state. The deep psychology of the hater's complete meltdown is violently triggered when they suddenly realize they are no longer just aggressively fighting you. They are actively, frantically fighting the massive universal laws of truth. And that is a massive war they absolutely cannot possibly win. When a defender suddenly steps up and fiercely, loudly advocates for you, it is absolutely not merely interpersonal drama. It is a profound, massive spiritual course correction. The universe highly often uses entirely ordinary people as massive instruments of deep divine justice. The defender is magnetically drawn to the undeniable, heavy gravity of reality that you naturally embody. It is exactly like walking into a highly dark, damp, deeply roach-infested basement and suddenly aggressively turning on a massive, high-wattage stadium floodlight. The frantic roaches absolutely do not scatter because they have a highly personal vendetta against the specific person who flipped the switch. They scatter in absolute, terrifying panic because their entire dark existence is fundamentally, completely incompatible with the blinding light. The haters' frantic, entirely goofy scrambling is the direct, highly embarrassing result of their artificial, deeply shadowy existence being violently subjected to the massive, blinding light of objective reality. The defender flipped the heavy switch, and the imitator is left completely exposed, scurrying frantically for cover, deeply terrified of the very massive truth that you have so comfortably built your entire beautiful life upon. Number 12. The absolute, highly visible panic of the performative mind occurs when they realize their borrowed, flickering light cannot cast a shadow on your innate, burning sun. The highly insecure people who secretly, obsessively compete with you completely operate from a massive, deep deficit of genuine spiritual energy. They are essentially highly parasitic emotional vampires. They entirely cannot generate their own authentic light, so they must constantly, frantically steal, heavily borrow, or cheaply manufacture it. Contrast your innate, massive, highly self-sustaining spiritual fire with their incredibly brittle, heavily forced charisma and highly calculated, entirely fake empathy. They walk arrogantly into a room exactly like someone wildly waving an incredibly cheap, highly plastic flashlight with rapidly dying batteries, aggressively demanding that absolutely everyone marvel at their massive brilliance. For a short while, in the pitch dark, they might completely convince a few highly gullible people that they are the absolute source of the light. But you, chosen one, operate entirely differently. You absolutely do not need a cheap flashlight. Your deep internal alignment, heavily forged through intense, massive spiritual pressure, has ignited a massive, self-sustaining sun entirely within your deep spirit. You absolutely don't have to try to shine. You simply, effortlessly, radiate massive heat. The deep psychology of the hater in this exact moment is marked by profound, frantic, deeply embarrassing desperation. The overnight flip completely happens when the people around you, specifically the exact one who steps up to fiercely defend you, finally completely adjust their eyes and recognize the massive, undeniable discrepancy between the two light sources. The defender naturally, effortlessly gravitates to the authentic, deeply warm, highly heavy gravity of your massive sun, completely and totally dismissing the hater's dying, flickering, incredibly cheap flashlight. The hater painfully realizes that no matter how incredibly hard they violently shake their flashlight, no matter how loudly they aggressively demand attention, they absolutely cannot possibly cast a shadow over a massive star. Their entire highly artificial identity entirely relies on highly perceived superiority. When the defender explicitly, loudly validates your innate light over their heavily borrowed performance, the hater's internal scaffolding completely buckles violently. You watch them become increasingly highly erratic, frantically trying to perform bigger, much louder, and far more aggressively, looking entirely goofy and deeply desperate in the sad process. Number 13. The fear's unexpected defense triggers the imitator's deepest, most violently guarded psychological fear: permanent, completely irreversible irrelevance. To a deeply toxic narcissist, a highly insecure imitator, or a fiercely toxic competitor, absolutely any form of attention is the massive oxygen they desperately breathe. They would highly prefer you absolutely hate them than completely ignore them. To them, intense hatred, deeply bitter rivalry, and highly continuous drama are perverse, highly sick forms of deep intimacy, contrast, your incredibly peaceful releasing of massive outcomes, and your total deep indifference to their highly fabricated drama with their white-knuckle, sweaty, highly frantic grip on aggressively controlling the narrative. They meticulously constructed this entire highly chaotic reality entirely because they desperately wanted to be the main, highly important character in the story of your massive life, even if they had to play the absolute villain to get the part. The deep psychology of their complete, highly visible panic is the sudden crushing realization that they can absolutely never, ever try this massive manipulation against you again. Their highly fake credibility is permanently, entirely scorched earth. When a sudden defender steps up and heavily handles the situation, and you completely remain quiet, entirely unbothered, and highly aligned, it directly delivers a completely lethal psychological blow to the hater's incredibly fragile ego. It proves, absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you have completely moved on, and far worse, the entire world is rapidly moving on entirely with you. The defender's highly vocal intervention signals the absolute, entirely permanent end of the hater's relevance. It is the massive difference between pouring incredibly wet sand into a flimsy mold versus pouring highly industrial-grade concrete. For a long, painful time, the toxic situation felt highly fluid. The hater kept violently kicking the wet sand, frantically reshaping the false narrative, rapidly building little fake castles of deep lies. But your massive patience completely allowed heavy time to pass. And while they were highly distracted by their own frantic performance, the heavy concrete completely began to cure. It hardened perfectly and undeniably around the massive truth of exactly who you are. The hater is now violently kicking a highly solid wall of cured concrete, breaking their own toes, screaming in absolute agony. Number 14. This highly sudden, overnight flip is the massive universe's undeniable, highly tangible receipt for your steadfast, unyielding spiritual endurance and unbothered alignment. The profound, massive shift you are deeply experiencing right now is absolutely not a mere coincidence of highly random human behavior. It is the highly final, absolutely concrete culmination of an intensely grueling spiritual curriculum. Contrast a beautiful life built entirely for the long haul, heavily anchored in incredibly deep roots, entirely unshakable faith, and highly raw honesty, with a highly fake life built entirely in a temporary, highly flimsy tent, meticulously designed for a traveling circus of deep drama and cheap validation. For an incredibly long time, you heavily paid a very massive price in the deep currency of extreme patience, highly silent tears, and heavily maintaining your incredibly high vibrational alignment when it made absolutely no logical sense to do so. You quietly watched the highly toxic people around you seemingly wildly thrive on their deep lies, and you may have deeply wondered if the massive universe had completely forgotten you. The deep psychology of the hater's massive, highly public meltdown is deeply rooted in the sudden, entirely violent realization of their own massive cosmic obsolescence. The massive divine timeline is meticulously, entirely precise. The highly toxic hater, the frantic imitator, the highly orchestrated smear campaign. They were absolutely all just highly temporary cosmic tools. Incredibly heavy weights used entirely by the universe to deeply build your massive spiritual muscle and highly refine your deep discernment. Once the massive lesson is entirely complete, the highly toxic tool is aggressively, permanently discarded. The fierce, highly sudden overnight defense of your beautiful name is the massive universe officially, permanently closing the account. It is the highly anticipated delivery of your massive receipt of total victory. They entirely realize they have completely outlived their highly toxic usefulness in your beautiful story, and they are entirely left standing completely alone, holding the massive, entirely unpaid karmic bill for their own highly unearned malice. They arrogantly planted massive fields of deeply bitter, highly toxic seeds, desperately hoping to forcefully make you eat the terrible harvest. Instead, the suddenly awakened defender and the massive universe have gently ushered you to a highly beautiful table of complete vindication, while the highly toxic hater is forcefully seated deeply in the dirt, absolutely compelled to painfully consume every single rotten fruit they proudly grew. When you finally zoom out and deeply look at the incredibly magnificent, highly complex architecture of absolutely all of this, one massive, overarching truth becomes entirely impossible to ever ignore again. None of this incredibly heavy conflict was ever actually about your specific physical actions, your supposed mistakes, or the highly fabricated narratives they desperately tried to spin against you. The absolute, real, undeniably singular target was entirely always your pristine energy, your undeniable massive spiritual alignment, and the highly quiet, incredibly heavy peace that deeply resides in your absolute core. The highly toxic orchestrators of your immense pain were absolutely never fighting a regular human being. They were desperately, frantically shadowboxing against the glaring, deeply uncomfortable, entirely massive reflection of their own profound, deeply rotting inadequacy. They arrogantly thought they could deeply bury you under a massive mountain of highly fabricated consensus lies, completely failing to deeply realize that you are a highly rare seed, uniquely designed to violently germinate in the absolute, utter darkness. They aggressively targeted your highly authentic light exactly because it violently exposed their highly performative, deeply fake shadows. Chosen one, you absolutely do not need to perform. You entirely do not need to rush back into those highly toxic rooms to seek petty revenge. You absolutely do not need to gloat over their highly public, entirely embarrassing unraveling. And you certainly do not need to desperately beg for fake apologies from the exact people who are currently watching their entire, deeply counterfeit empire burn violently to the ground. The massive universe has violently, permanently shifted the heavy scales entirely on your behalf. The highly sudden, fierce defense of your pristine character by incredibly unexpected voices is simply the highly outward manifestation of the massive divine vindication you deeply earned through your agonizing, highly silent endurance. Your absolute only job now is to completely remain absolutely unbothered, deeply anchored, and fiercely, undeniably authentic. Let the frantic mimics entirely exhaust themselves, desperately trying to keep up. Let the highly toxic manipulators completely drown in the paranoid, highly embarrassing panic of their completely collapsing script. Keep beautifully growing. Keep meticulously building your highly heavy, entirely immovable architecture, and let your absolute, massive peace completely become the ultimate, entirely undeniable consequence for absolutely everyone who mistakenly believed they could play God with your massive destiny. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Stay chosen, stay blessed.